The title of my presentation today is The Math Lesson You Always Wanted But Never Had. And I'd like to take this opportunity before I start my lecture to say that I feel extremely honoured and privileged for the opportunity to deliver the last lecture for the 2014 academic year. And I would like to thank our Vice-Chancellor, Professor Sandra Harding, and the Student Association for the invitation to deliver this lecture. Now, one book that I'd like to tell you about that I've read to help prepare for this last lecture is called The Math Book. And this book is written by Clifford Pickover. And Pickover says, "For me, mathematics cultivates a perpetual state of wonder about the nature of mind, the limits of thoughts, and our place in this vast cosmos." And I thought I'd show you this book because it has 250 intriguing mathematical milestones in the history of mathematics. So if you know of anyone who's interested in mathematics, I think they would enjoy reading this book. I'll just go over a few examples of the stories that are in this math book. The first article is about the ant odometer. And ants are these amazing creatures. They've got this inbuilt compass, and they're able to work out how many steps they need to take to make it back to their nest. And in Pickover's book, it describes how biologists elongated the ants' legs, and when they did that, the ants overshot their mark, and when the biologists shortened their legs, the ants did not quite make it back to their nest. So ants are very good at counting. Then the next story goes on to talk about primates, and of course all of these stories are actually written in chronological order, and it talks about how primates can count and then enter that number into a keyboard on a computer. It talks about the life cycles of cicadas being a prime number so that they are hunted less often by other predators who might have a life cycle, say, on 2 years or 4 years. And there's lots of stories, and finally it finishes up in 2007 on an article about the mathematical universe hypothesis. And on this particular story, it talks about an article that was published by a cosmologist called Max Tegmark, who says, "Our universe is not just described by mathematics, it is mathematics." Now, I'll let you be the judge of that, but what I'd like to show you is some marvellous coincidences between mathematics and nature. Now, something which is all around us is fractals. And fractals can be described by mathematical equations, and they show self-similar repeating patterns, and as you zoom in on the pattern, you start to see the same pattern over and over and over again. Examples of where we see fractals in real life are with lightning. Trees can also be considered a fractal. As we zoom in on the branches of those trees, we effectively see smaller and smaller trees. Now, there's no leaves on these trees, but if there were leaves on these trees, we could actually use fractal mathematics to, for example, compute the amount of carbon dioxide absorbed by the leaves, and that could be helpful if we went to a carbon accounting system. Fractals also exist in African culture. Okay, at the first layer here, what we've got is an image of an individual house. Okay, and then what we have is a house within a family compound, and then we have a village which is actually made up of several compounds. We even eat fractals. Broccoli is an example of a fractal. As we chop up the broccoli in smaller pieces, we again see the same pattern as the original broccoli, but it's just at a smaller scale. Here's an example of some mathematics that can be used to generate a fractal. What we've done here is we've started with a straight line, and we've bent the line at a random angle near the center, and this has been repeated, and the shape of this fractal then appears like a two-dimensional form of a mountain. And of course, you can take this to a three-dimensional setting, and this kind of mathematics has been used to generate special effects in movies like Star Trek and Star Wars. The Great Barrier Reef can also be considered a fractal, and even cells in our bodies are fractals. The top picture here shows a cell from a healthy human, and the picture on the bottom shows a cell from a person with leukemia. And what we can actually do is we can compute something called a fractal dimension, which measures the smoothness of the fractal, and we can use this fractal dimension then to determine if a cell might be healthy or unhealthy. And some researchers have actually applied this fractal dimension methodology to determine if reefs are healthy or unhealthy. So here's a pattern that you may have seen before. The outside numbers are ones, and all of the other numbers add to the two numbers immediately above that. And this, of course, is Pascal's triangle. What you may not have known about Pascal's triangle is that if you replace the even numbers with a dot and you leave the odd numbers as blank white space, then you end up with yet another fractal pattern. Here's another pattern that we see quite a lot in nature. And if we sum the previous two numbers, so 1 and 1 will give us 2, 1 and 2 will give us 3, 2 and 3 will give us 5. And continuing that on, we end up with this famous sequence, which is, of course, the Fibonacci sequence. The interesting thing about the Fibonacci sequence is that if we take the ratio of any two consecutive numbers, then we get a number that converges to 1.618, which is our golden ratio. Now, if we just remember those numbers in the Fibonacci sequence, and those numbers are sometimes called Fibonacci numbers, and in many plants, for example, the number of petals might actually be a Fibonacci number. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to draw a square of the dimension of the Fibonacci sequence. So the first number in that sequence was a 1. So this is a square of dimension 1 by 1. We also had another square of dimension 1 by 1. The next number was a 2. So that's a small square there of 2 by 2. And then we had a square which was of dimension 3. And we're slowly just building up all of these squares. The dimension of the squares again are from the Fibonacci sequence. And then that is how we get a golden rectangle. Now if we take our compass and we connect the diagonals of our squares, okay, we get the golden spiral, and we see this a lot in nature. So for example with our nautilus shell, and incidentally there's another fractal pattern there within our nautilus shell. Some artists have also adopted the golden spiral in their paintings. And I'm not sure if you can see the golden spiral in the School of Athens. And what I'll do now is I'll just zoom to the next picture to show you where Raphael has incorporated the golden spiral. So Raphael centered the golden spiral on Plato. Another example of where we see the golden spiral is with the rose. And we generally find things in nature that follow this golden spiral to be very pleasing. And so photographers also take the golden spiral to help make better photographs. So this is just a picture of a ship, okay, and it's been edited so that it follows the golden spiral. So a lot of software editing programs will have the option for you to edit your photographs so that they conform to the golden spiral. But when you're taking your photographs, it can be hard to work out, looking through the viewfinder, where exactly this golden spiral is. So a derivative of the golden spiral is our rule of thirds, and you may have seen this pattern on your iPhone. Sort of looks like a noughts and crosses grid. And if you put the interesting feature that you'd like to capture in your photograph on one of these intersecting lines, then that can enhance your photo. Other spirals that exist in the human body is the cochlea. We have spirals in outer space, and something that many North Queenslanders will remember is our tropical cyclone Yasi that crossed the coast in 2011. And of course, if we're in the northern hemisphere, those spirals would go in the other direction. So the first take-home message from the lecture today is that the book of nature is written in the language of mathematics. So despite all the beauty that surrounds mathematics, for many students, the mere anticipation of doing math is worse than drawing blood. It causes students to withdraw both physically and emotionally. So keeping this in mind, what we actually did at James Cook University as part of the curriculum refresh was we developed a new subject which involved mathematics, science and computing. And this subject was actually compulsory for the entire first year science cohort. And the subject was divided into 3 case studies. The first was about the greenhouse effect and delivered by Professor Peter Ridd. And what Peter did was he developed energy balance equations where he computed the energy fluxes that come into the Earth and equated that with the energy fluxes that went out of the Earth, and posed questions to the students about, what would happen to the surface temperature of the Earth if, say, the Earth's albedo was to increase by a certain percentage. Microsoft Excel was used to help the students compute their answers and to produce graphs so that they could work out, for example, how long it would take for the Earth's temperature to reach an equilibrium. A second case study was about climate prediction and impacts from tropical oceans. And here, for example, we showed students how to use least squares regressions. And in this particular graph on the vertical axis, what we've got is the number of breeding pairs of sooty terns versus a climate index. And what we can see here is that there is a trend, in this case, going down. The vertical deviations from the points to the lines is what we call the residuals. And to check that there's no pattern that hasn't been captured by the model, we can plot the residuals versus our fitted values. We've also produced some climate forecasting tools as part of this case study, and we've produced, in this example, the chance of rainfall, the chance of exceeding median rainfall for October, November, December, based on a particular climate pattern. This is our current climate map. And our students only do this for one rain gauge, but if they had every single rain gauge around the world, they could produce this map. And so what we're seeing here for northeastern Australia is that there's about a 30% chance of exceeding median rainfall for the October to December period. And that, of course, is denoted by the orange and the reddish colouring here on the legend. The third case study is called Will Your Grandchildren Eat Fish? And this is delivered by Professor Sean Connolly. And Sean motivates his case study by showing a time series of photographs. And these photographs are taken from a board in Florida Keys. And people go out each day on a charter and they come back and then they hang the biggest fish that they caught on their fishing trip. And this is what that board looked like in 1957. And then in the early 1980s, this is what the board looked like. Same dock, same place. And in 2007, this is what the trophy board looked like. So we can obviously see there a reduction in the number of fish that were hung on this board, and the size of the fish has dramatically decreased over time. One model that we use to help describe how the fish populations grow is a basic geometric growth model. So if one fish was to produce on average 2 new fish, then the next generation would have 2 fish. And then that 2 fish would turn into 4 fish, those 4 fish would turn into 8 fish, and 16 fish at the next iteration. And of course that follows a geometric growth pattern. And there's obviously some problems with that, in that eventually the fish will run out of resources. So we have to look at more complicated models to explain how the populations evolve. But what we try to tell the students in our class is that mathematics is a very transferable language. And unfortunately, in this particular situation, this same model could, for example, be used to help explain the spread of the Ebola virus. If one person was to infect 2 other people, then we can quite easily see how quickly the Ebola virus can spread. I think the 2 might be a slight overestimate though, and when I last checked, I think that it was one person infecting approximately 1.7 people. So in developing the subject, we had to think of ways in which we could effectively integrate the software competency into the subject. And my idea was that if we chose the right software, we might be able to use that in a particular way that would build mathematical confidence and reduce mathematical anxiety, with the view of students doing well in the subject. So the first year that we offered the subject, we actually measured software competency, we measured mathematical confidence, and we measured mathematical anxiety. And we measured this in week 1 and in week 13 of semester. And it was a paired design. And if there was no difference between week 1 and week 13, we would expect to see the change in scores to be roughly about 0% and to follow that dotted line. And ideally what we'd hope for is to have mathematical confidence to increase along with software competency. We'd like students to become better at using the software and to feel more confident in using the software as the semester progressed. And we were also hoping that mathematical anxiety would decrease as a result of the subject. So how did we go? Well, let's have a look at the good news story first. Students perceived that their ability and software competency improved throughout the semester, but unfortunately mathematical anxiety actually increased and mathematical confidence actually decreased. So students were more anxious in week 13 than what they were in week 1, and in week 13 students felt like they were less confident in mathematics than what they were at the beginning of the semester. So clearly we needed to rethink the situation and we needed to impose some teaching interventions. I was fortunate enough to have this great team behind me, and so I asked them what we should do, and they said we need to think more about student engagement. So some of the things that we did to encourage student engagement in the years that followed was we thought more about technology support. Now, when you're learning a new technology, people often traverse through 3 emotions. The first emotion is fear, then frustration, and then familiarity. Now, in the first year that we offered the subject, probably right about at this stage here where the axe is smashing the computer, we were delivering a crash course in mathematics at the same time. So in future years, what we did was we staggered the lectures so that students had more time to get on top of Microsoft Excel, and we also introduced screencasts to help students with becoming more confident with Excel technologies. We had a lot more interactions between students and staff. We had more feedback given to students on their learning by way of assignments. We had tutor and coordinator meetings, we had lecturer and coordinator meetings, and we also introduced a learning advisor who was not only able to help the students with the mathematics, but the learning advisor was also able to contextualise the mathematics in the context of the science problem. So that was very helpful. We tried to establish the relevance of the subject, and so we targeted tutors who were actually experienced in interdisciplinary science research so that they could tell the students in their class how they were using mathematical models to help with their research. We changed the subject name from Systems Modelling and Visualisation, which was really a very broad name, to something more targeted, and now the subject is actually called Modelling Natural Systems. And to explain the idea of what interdisciplinary science was, we designed this logo, which shows the elements of interdisciplinary science of being the science, the mathematics, and the computing. Another thing that we changed was the assessment. We introduced assessment for learning and assessment of learning. The assessment for learning was done by way of weekly assignments, so the students would hand in each week some assignments, the tutors would go away and mark that. The tutors would hand back the assignments to the students, and the assignments, if you like, formed a boundary object that facilitated learning discussions between the tutors and the students. The assessment of learning was a little bit more difficult in that we had tests and exams, whereas the assessment for learning was really just to encourage students to stay engaged with the subject and to provide an opportunity for quick feedback if the students were missing some important concepts that they needed as part of the subject. Even though we had multiple lecturers deliver the subject, we had a unified assessment approach where the question styling was similar and the cognitive load was similar across the different pieces of assessment. The main carrot, however, was this 2-scheme assessment structure, and what we did here was that if students obtained a credit average or better with their on-course material, they did not have to take the final exam. And so what this meant was that students were trying very hard, very early on in the subject, to do well with their assessment. So, did the intervention work? Well, in 2011, software competency remained about the same or slightly improved. We had mathematical anxiety actually decrease throughout the semester, which is what we wanted, and we wanted mathematical confidence to actually increase throughout the semester, and we achieved that in 2011 by adopting a much stronger student engagement focus in our teaching delivery strategy. Now, that continued through to 2012. There are a number of other things that we achieved as part of this framework, and that is the proportion of students who obtained a credit average or higher actually increased, but the number of students who obtained a high distinction, or the proportion of students who obtained a high distinction, actually remained steady. And students have commented, having two different marking schemes has really helped me push to achieve better marks. I have enjoyed having more control over my learning. The proportion of students that disengaged after the HEX census date has also declined steadily since 2010. And another thing that we achieved from this framework was that the pass rates of students that had an OP score of between 11 to 24 actually increased after we introduced the intervention in 2010. Now, a lot of those student engagement strategies that I spoke about previously have been summarised in our paper, which was published in the International Journal of Mathematical Education in Science and Technology. So you can refer to that paper for some more details. And I'd just like to take this opportunity again to thank my team for all their continued support over the many years in designing and delivering the subject. So the second take-home message from this presentation is that increased student engagement coincided with increased mathematical confidence and a decrease in mathematical anxiety. So the next part of my talk is about big data. Now, big data is about the collection, storage, analysis, visualization, and interpretation of large data sets. And we can actually do that because of the way modern technology has advanced. Just to give you an example of how our data sets have become bigger over time, I thought I'd use Microsoft Excel as an example. Now, in Excel 1995, the biggest data set that you could have in Excel could have 16,000 rows and 200 columns. But in Excel 2013, the biggest data set that you can actually have 1 million rows and 16,000 columns. So obviously, the size and the ease with which we can collect data means that we need to have software packages that can handle larger data sets. This is an example of some data that was collected from the Ames ship between 2008 and 2014. It actually shows the path that was traced by the Ames ship, and there was a sensor attached beneath this ship that measured things like salinity and fluorescence of the water. Now, this particular data set actually had 8 million data points, so it's still too big for Excel. So sometimes we actually need to use more specialised packages to analyse and interrogate these larger data sets. An example of a data mining methodology that's been applied to Dolphin sounds, which can be helpful for conservation management, was done by one of my students, Alvaro Berg-Soto, and has been published in the Journal of the Acoustical Society of America. And what we were doing there is we were trying to listen to the sounds of dolphins and to determine what species of dolphins we were actually listening to. So Alvaro went out and collected sounds from two different species of dolphins. One was a humpback and the other was a snubfin, and listened to the sounds or used the data embedded in the spectrograms to try and distinguish between two different species of dolphins in Queensland. And this is an example of three of the main vocalizations that the dolphins make. This is a click. I'll just do that again. And this is a burst pulse. And this is a whistle. And the spectrogram measures on the vertical axis frequency versus time. And what we've done is we've extracted from this spectrogram effectively two numbers that are then plotted in an XY space, and we've coloured in the dots red if the data came from a snubfin dolphin, we've coloured in the dots blue if the spectrogram or if the data came from a spectrogram of a humpback. And what we can see here is that a lot of the red dots form on the left of the graph, while a lot of the blue dots form on the right of the graph. So what that means is that we don't have a perfect model, but if we have a point that falls way over here on the right, with a reasonable amount of confidence, you can assume that that was produced by a humpback. And if it falls way over on the left with a reasonable amount of confidence, you can assume that the data that generated that point came from a stumpfin. And so this information could then be used to help with conservation management by way of estimating dolphin numbers and even the numbers of particular species. Now, we can't have a talk about big data and not talk about the Higgs boson. Now, sometimes the media refers to the Higgs boson as the God particle, and when looking for the Higgs boson, it really is like looking for the needle in the haystack. The ATLAS experiment was conducted to help find the Higgs boson and to verify a long-standing theory back in the 1960s about the very existence of this particle. So the Large Hadron Collider was set up in CERN, and the Large Hadron Collider fires particles at each other at these amazing speeds, not quite at the speed of light, but very, very fast. And the accuracy with which these particles are fired at each other is kind of like firing two needles at each other 10 kilometers apart. So the accuracy is amazing. And when these particles smash into each other, all sorts of things happen that only a quantum physicist can explain. But if we're looking for the Higgs boson, then we actually find a particular pattern emerge in the data. The problem is that to find this pattern, we actually have to sift through a large amount of data. Now, if I was to store all of the data collected for the ATLAS experiment, say in a year, that would require me to be able to store 25 petabytes. So for me, if I was to store this on an iPhone, I would need 1 million iPhones to be able to store all of this data. Now, what I'd like to do now is to give you an exercise at trying to find this needle in the haystack. And what the scientists at CERN have done is, instead of showing you data, they've actually produced a sonification of data from the ATLAS experiment, where they have assigned a musical note to each data point. Now, the point that corresponds to the existence of the Higgs boson, which supports this long-lying theory and helps to form part of a theory that explains how some particles that don't have mass actually gain mass, is with this music. So the high note corresponds to the existence of the Higgs boson. And I want you to listen and see if you can determine the Higgs boson. So listen out for the high note. I'm not sure how you went there, if you were able to detect the high note, but to give you some help with that, what I'm going to do now is to play a video of exactly the same music, but every time you see the hand come into the screen, that signifies the high note. So what we've actually got in this piece of music is 3 pieces of music. The first piece is the piano only, and then we've got the whole orchestra joining in. Now, of course, one of the challenges that we have when we're dealing with these really big data sets is that of between correlation and causation. And just because two things are correlated, it doesn't mean that one causes the other. And as an example of this, I'd like to show you a paper that was published in Nature in 1988. And this paper shows the number of pairs of breeding storks and how the population has decreased, and then the number of newborn babies in West Germany and how that has also declined except for the small blip at the end. So just because those two lines follow each other does not mean that one causes the other, and maybe there is some other underlying mechanism that might be contributing to that relationship. Now, one relationship which hopefully makes a little bit more sense than the previous example is that between life expectancy and the number of children born per woman. And this is a graph that was produced using data from Gapminder. And if you're interested in looking at patterns in data and looking at different relationships between different variables, you might enjoy going to this website and having a look at the kind of data that has been stored there. Now, in this particular graph, it shows the relationship between life expectancy on the vertical axis and total fertility on the x-axis. Each dot corresponds to a country around the world, and the size of the dot corresponds to the population of that country, and the colour of the dots corresponds to the region of the globe that data were collected from. And the large dot here, of course, is China. And in the 1940s, there was a lot of countries that had a high fertility rate and a low life expectancy. Now let's have a look at how that trend changes over time. So we've seen a lot of countries move from having a high fertility rate and low life expectancy to a low fertility rate and a high life expectancy. And you might like to actually Google Hans Rolling's interpretation of that evolution in the trend, and he calls that as if he's like calling the Melbourne Cup, and it's really very engaging. So I encourage you to go and look for that on YouTube. And it's interesting because if you look for Australia in that graph, when the baby bonus was introduced, you can just start to see how the fertility rate increased ever so slightly for Australia. So looking at how patterns change over time is very interesting, and we can adopt that principle in agriculture. If we have a look at how trends change over time, that can help us to farm better. Now, something in agriculture that you may not have heard about is called precision agriculture. And what this means is that we're able to collect more data in agricultural domains, and we can use this data to help apply the right inputs at the right time with the aim of increasing productivity and reducing or minimising inputs applied to the crop. So if we can identify spatial patterns which are similar over time, you can develop targeted farming practices to exploit those particular patterns. Another data mining example is that by the Food and Drug Administration in the USA, where they had an adverse event reporting system. So people that were taking medications and experiencing bad effects of those medications, they could go to this website, plug in the kinds of medications they were taking and the effects that they were having from that medication. And when people actually mined this particular website, they found that people who were taking a particular antidepressant in combination with a cholesterol-lowering medication caused their blood glucose levels to increase. And so what that meant was, for diabetics in particular, that could be very problematic. So doctors were able to input that information onto this website, as were people, and so that meant that doctors were better able to help their patients that had diabetes and be able to provide better advice about prescribing different medications. Another example of the kind of data that we've looked at is spectral data, and this is a spectral signature here. And to obtain this particular graph, what you need to do is to shine effectively light at a particular substance at a particular wavelength, and you measure how much light is either transmitted or reflected from the substance, and then you get this particular signature. And you could do this, for example, of medications. And if you did this for medications, you could use this technology then to help deduce if some medications were counterfeit or not. And this is a basic tree algorithm that we can use to analyze data like this. We'd pass all spectra initially in the initial node, and then you might go to a particular wavelength and say, okay, well, if the transmittance was less than, say, 10% at the 1160 wavelength, we'll put all spectra into this box here. And then you'd say, okay, well, of the spectra that made it to this box here, of those at the wavelength 1300 nanometers, how many of those had a transmittance less than 70%? And you'd shift all of those spectra again to the left. And then you could say, okay, well, these are our counterfeit medications. So that's just an example of some more larger data sets and some analysis methods that you could apply to help identify if medications were counterfeit or not. So the third take-home message from today is that big data technologies, if used effectively, can improve practices in agriculture, medicine, conservation, and many more fields. So this leads me to another book that I read to help develop this lecture, and this book is called Reckoning with Risk by Gigerenzer. And Gigerenzer says that the fiction that fingerprinting, DNA fingerprinting, HIV tests, or other excellent new technologies are absolutely foolproof is like a dream fulfilling a deep unconscious wish. Another thing that Gigerenzer says in his book is that humans are basically like the ant. We love to count, but we are hopeless at probability. And in Gigerenzer's book, he gives lots of examples of how probabilities have been misunderstood and misinterpreted by society. Another thing that Gigerenzer says is that the way in which humans make decisions varies across a number of scales, from being very rational, so like an economist might say you should make the decision such that the expected value of that decision is maximised in the long run, to very irrational. So, for example, based on the laws of probability, I should fear falling off a ladder more than what I fear of being bitten by a snake. But of course I fear snakes more than what I do falling off a ladder. So what does this have to do with big data? Well, big data may not always equal a big outcome. And why is that? Well, I propose that if we're going to move from data and a lot of data to an outcome, we need to generate the knowledge, and we're doing that today. We're seeing that published in the literature. But as noted by Gigerenzer, that knowledge is incomplete and it has some level of uncertainty attached to that knowledge. And in order to generate an outcome, we need a person to take that imperfect knowledge and make a decision or act upon that information in some way. And what we're seeing today is that some large corporations are actually being very successful with handling big data, and that they're able to generate huge profits, for example, by targeting or developing marketing strategies based on big data. But I'm interested in sustainability, and we are collecting a lot of information now in the agricultural and environmental domains. And over the next decade, I hope that we can turn that data and that knowledge into outcome in pursuit of sustainable solutions for our future. So that leads me to two more take-home messages, in that we as data scientists should think about how we communicate uncertainty in big data technologies to people that make decisions on that knowledge generated, and that organisations best equipped to manage risk will benefit from big data technologies. So just to summarise my talk, the book of nature is written in the language of mathematics. Increased student engagement coincided with increased mathematical confidence and a decrease in mathematical anxiety. Big data technologies, if used effectively, can improve practices in agriculture, medicine, conservation, and many more fields. And we need to think about how we communicate uncertainty in big data technologies to decision makers, and organisations best equipped to manage risk will benefit from big data technologies. So thank you very much for your attention.